For more than 2 decades, Benny Hill was untouchable. His comedy sketches ruled television screens across the world. He was the cheeky grin, the unstoppable chase, the man everyone laughed with, and sometimes at. But in 1989, everything changed. Without warning, the very network that made him a star pulled the plug. No farewell show, no grand finale, just one quiet meeting that ended 21 years of laughter. For years, the story sounded simple. Executives blamed ratings. They said the show was getting tired. But now, decades later, a former co-star has stepped forward with a very different story. One that shines a harsh light on what really went on behind those studio walls. Because Benny Hill's downfall was never just about ratings or cost. It was about loyalty, pride, and a culture changing faster than anyone inside that studio could keep up with. And when you hear what this co-star finally revealed, you'll never look at Benny Hill or the way he was fired the same way again. Before the scandal, before the firing, there was just a young man chasing laughter. Born Alfred Hawthorne Hill in January 1924, Benny grew up obsessed with the simple joy of making people smile. He wasn't born into fame, far from it. His father ran a circus, his mother worked long hours, and Benny spent his early years soaking in the rhythm of British music halls. He started as a stagehand, sweeping floors and changing props, until one day, someone missed a cue, and Benny jumped in to fill the silence. That single moment changed everything. His knack for timing and his expressive face made audiences roar, and within a few years, he'd gone from backstage helper to headliner. When television arrived, Benny saw opportunity. In 1955, The Benny Hill Show hit British screens, a mix of slapstick, sketch comedy, and catchy tunes, and it exploded. By the 1970s, Hill wasn't just famous, he was global. His show aired in over 100 countries, drawing hundreds of millions of viewers. He didn't need words to make you laugh, just a silly grin, a funny hat, and that iconic chase scene music. At his peak, Benny Hill was earning more than the Prime Minister. He was comedy royalty, adored by fans, envied by peers, and untouchable in television ratings. But, as history often proves, the higher you climb, the harder the fall. And for Benny Hill, those first cracks in the crown were already starting to show. By the early 1980s, something was changing behind the laughter. The same sketches that once drew thunderous applause now made some viewers shift in their seats. Critics began calling the show outdated, too cheeky, even sexist. But Benny didn't see it that way. He believed humor was universal, that people just wanted to laugh. Yet television was evolving fast. A new generation of comedians was rewriting the rules, smarter, edgier, more politically aware. Meanwhile, Benny stuck to what had always worked: silly faces, slapstick gags, and the famous chase sequence endings. It was classic Benny Hill, but to younger audiences, it started to feel like a rerun. Behind the scenes, the tension grew. Producers whispered about costs rising, scripts felt repetitive. The spark that once made Benny unstoppable was flickering. Even his longtime director, Dennis Kirkland, struggled to convince him to modernize the show. But Benny was stubborn. He'd built his empire by trusting his instincts, and he wasn't about to change now. Still, the network was losing patience. Viewers were slipping away, advertisers were tightening budgets, and executives began asking quiet questions about the show's future. And then one day, those quiet questions turned into a meeting that would change everything, because Benny Hill was about to walk into a room and walk out without a career. It was May 1989. After 21 years of loyal service, Benny Hill walked into Thames Television expecting a routine conversation. Instead, he was told the unthinkable. The Benny Hill Show, the show that defined an entire era of British comedy, was being cancelled. No warning, no celebration, just a few words that shattered decades of work. Executives told him ratings were falling, production costs were too high, and the format felt tired. The decision came from John Howard Davies, head of Light Entertainment, the same man who once helped launch Benny's success. Hill was blindsided. He had given everything to that show, even filming through illness and exhaustion to keep his audience entertained. And yet, in that sterile meeting room, none of it mattered. The laughter, the legacy, the global fame, all swept aside in a single conversation. What hurt more wasn't the decision itself, but how cold it felt. No farewell episode, no grand goodbye. One of the biggest television stars in the world simply vanished from the screen overnight. But here's the thing. That official explanation never quite added up. Yes, the ratings dipped slightly, but the show was still pulling millions worldwide. So why the rush to end it? That question haunted fans for decades until one co-star, years later, finally decided to speak, and what they revealed turned everything we thought we knew about Benny Hill's firing upside down. For more than 30 years, people believed the official story: falling ratings, rising costs, changing tastes. It sounded neat. It sounded professional. But as it turns out, it wasn't the full truth. Recently, one of Benny's longtime co-stars finally spoke out. They described a very different picture behind the scenes, one of exhaustion, tension, and a man trapped by his own success. According to them, Benny wasn't just a comedian, he was a perfectionist. He would rewrite sketches again and again, sometimes until early morning, refusing to compromise on a single gag. And while that obsession once made the show brilliant, it eventually made it unbearable. Producers grew frustrated. Crew members complained that working hours were endless, and Benny, now in his 60s, had grown more isolated than ever, rarely socializing, often eating alone on set, clutching his scripts like armor. The co-star revealed that network executives had started to view him not as a national treasure, but as a problem they couldn't control. They said the network wanted a new image, something younger, something modern. But nobody dared tell Benny that directly, until that fateful meeting. To the world, it looked like business. To those inside the studio, it felt like betrayal. And according to that same co-star, the shock didn't just end Benny's career, it broke something inside him. But even that wasn't the whole story. Because what was happening outside the studio, in the entire comedy world, would soon make Benny Hill's firing look like a symbol of something much bigger. By the mid-'80s, comedy itself had changed. The same sketches that once brought families together now sparked arguments in living rooms. The rise of alternative comedy, sharp, political, socially aware, was rewriting what audiences found funny. Names like Rowan Atkinson, Rick Mayall, and Dawn French were taking over the stage with humor that questioned authority, not just chased it in slow motion. Benny Hill's world, meanwhile, was built on simplicity. Silly faces, fast music, and slapstick charm. But the culture around him had moved on. The chase scenes that once drew cheers now drew complaints. People began to say the jokes were out of touch and that the laughter came at the expense of others. And suddenly, networks grew nervous. Sponsors wanted safer faces, younger stars, and fewer headlines about controversy. But here's the twist. While Britain cooled on Benny Hill, the rest of the world couldn't get enough. His shows aired in over 100 countries. In America, he was a cult favorite. In Australia and Europe, reruns pulled massive ratings. He was still one of the most recognizable British faces on television. That global success made his firing sting even more. How could someone still adored overseas be seen as outdated at home? It wasn't more than irony. It was a shift in how comedy was judged, not just by laughs, but by image. And for Benny Hill, that change wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal. Because the moment the camera stopped rolling, he realized how alone he really was. After his show was canceled, Benny Hill disappeared from the spotlight almost overnight. For a man who had lived and breathed performance, the silence that followed was deafening. Gone were the studio lights, the laughter, the long days on set. He retreated to a small flat in Teddington, just a short walk from the very studios that once made him famous. Those close to him say he was never quite the same. He still wrote sketches, still believed he might get another chance, but the phone never rang. Friends recalled seeing him wander the streets alone, quietly humming theme tunes from his old shows. And though reruns of The Benny Hill Show played across the globe, the man behind them lived a life of quiet isolation. In the years that followed, his health began to fail. He suffered from heart problems, and yet he refused offers of help. He stayed fiercely independent, perhaps to a fault. Some said he couldn't face hospitals because he didn't want to be recognized. Others believed he simply didn't care anymore. Then, in April 1992, Benny Hill was found lifeless in his flat, sitting in front of his television. The man who brought laughter to millions had spent his final days alone, surrounded by memories of a world that had moved on. For many, it felt like the saddest punchline imaginable, but as his co-star later said, Benny never hated anyone. He just couldn't keep up with how fast the world was changing. And that is perhaps the real tragedy. Not that he was fired, but that the laughter stopped before he did. Decades later, Benny Hill's story still divides people. To some, he was a comedic genius, a pioneer who made the world laugh without ever saying a cruel word. To others, he was a symbol of a dated era, one that refused to adapt when times changed. But the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. What few realize is that Benny never chased fame. Fame found him. He didn't party with celebrities, didn't crave attention, and didn't live extravagantly. He spent most of his fortune helping others, quietly paying bills for struggling friends, even sending money to old colleagues he barely knew anymore. Behind the laughter was a man who genuinely cared, but struggled to show it in a world that demanded bigger, fleshier smiles. And as comedy evolved, many of today's entertainers still credit him as an influence. His timing, his visual humor, his ability to make an entire room laugh without saying a single word, that was art. Even shows like Mr. Bean and Little Britain owe something to the groundwork Benny laid decades earlier. Yet his fall of grace remains a warning, a reminder that fame, no matter how bright, can fade faster than anyone expects. For every laugh track that plays, there's a performer behind it, hoping the world hasn't moved on without them. But the story doesn't end there, because what that co-star revealed all these years later changed how the world remembered Benny Hill forever. When that co-star finally broke their silence, the world listened. They said Benny Hill wasn't fired because he was offensive or because audiences had turned on him. He was let go because television itself had changed. And Benny, the man who built his career on timeless laughter, simply didn't fit the new mold. It wasn't betrayal from one person. It was the slow drift of an industry chasing something younger, faster, and more marketable. And in that shift, one of Britain's greatest entertainers became a casualty of progress. But here's the irony. Decades after his death, Benny Hill's clips are still watched by millions online. The same gags that were called outdated are now remembered as classics, proof that comedy, at its heart, never really ages. Time may have moved on, but laughter doesn't forget. Maybe that's why his story still hits so deeply. Because Benny Hill wasn't just a comedian, he was a reminder that fame, like humor, is fragile. And behind every spotlight, there's a person hoping their last laugh won't really be the last. So, what do you think? Was Benny Hill's firing a fair decision? Or did the industry give up on him too soon? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed uncovering the truth behind one of television's biggest legends, make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe to Retro Celeb Talk, where every week we bring you the untold stories of the stars you thought you knew.